All right, let's get this started. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Andy Bromberg. I'm co-founder and president of CoinList. Really excited to have today's edition of CoinList Chats here with the project that started it all at CoinList. The very first token sale we ever ran was Filecoin, and today we've got Pooja Shah, who's the Filecoin product lead over at Protocol Labs, who, among other things, are the maintainers and creators of the Filecoin project. So thanks so much for coming and being here.
Thanks so much, Andy. Really excited to be here.
Yeah. So for the audience, just a couple quick notes. First of all, as Justin just shared in the chat, if you have questions during this episode, during this chat, you can navigate to the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and just put your questions in there, and we'll get those answered either during the conversation or at the end of it. And we'll probably run for about 45 minutes here of conversation. And yeah, would love to see any questions you have, and we'll be happy to tackle those issues. But we'll dive right into it. Pooja, can you give a little context on what it means to be product lead over at Filecoin and what your day-to-day looks like working on the project?
Sure. So yes, I've been on the Filecoin project for around 2 years now, kind of wearing a number of different hats. Sort of previously was involved in orchestrating a number of our launches. So, when we first opened up the Filecoin project to the world, opened our code base, had the first development networks, and then also including our testnet launch, which was late last year in December. And now, as we're gearing up for Filecoin mainnet launch, we're starting to see a lot more usage within the ecosystem, both from the mining community and the developer community, and just people who are using Filecoin for storage for their own data, personal data, or their organization's data, or for their applications. And so we recently formed a product team, and the goal with the product initiative on Filecoin is to really make sure that we're understanding users of Filecoin, the various stakeholders in the ecosystem, understanding all of the different use cases, and making sure that Filecoin as a protocol can support all of those use cases, either around the 3 months or so after launch, or looking to the much longer term for several years after launch, so that we can really achieve this vision of Filecoin being the infrastructure and foundation for all of humanity's information one day.
Yeah, we will come back to a bunch of that, because I actually think that what you're doing and working on in terms of use cases and users is one of the things that makes Protocol Labs and the Filecoin team stand out from the rest of the crypto space. It often feels like a lot of technology being built for the sake of technology, which is wonderful. But at some point, this has to get in the hands of users, and we have to see real applications that real people want to use and see upside from. And so we'll talk about some of those advanced use cases. Let's maybe start a little bit further back, though, because I think this is important context for our conversation. Protocol Labs as an organization has a whole bunch of different projects under it. Probably too many to go into in great depth on this chat itself. But two of the biggest ones are IPFS and Filecoin. And a lot of people think of these as totally synonymous, and they're actually not, right? There's different people working on them. And so could you maybe disambiguate that a little bit for us and break down kind of what is IPFS, what's the history there, and then what's Filecoin, and what's the relationship between those two?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great starting point. So IPFS and Filecoin in some ways are kind of trying to solve a similar problem, but from different angles. So IPFS as a project has been around it's really the project that that Protocol Labs started with. So it's been around since maybe 2014. I think the first commit was in 2013. And really IPFS over time, so the initial, actually the origin story for IPFS was, Juan was thinking about how do we move large scientific data sets between different researchers and scientific communities in different parts of the world really efficiently, so that scientists can collaborate on large data sets together and share their insights with each other, and just forward the process of scientific inquiry. And I think as in the process of trying to think about solutions for this, realized that there actually isn't a really great solution for this today. So IPFS was kind of the first attempt at solving this problem by building a peer-to-peer file system where users on the network could share data. They could put their data sort of like in this network, and other users could find that data addressed by its content ID, which is kind of a unique feature of IPFS and a lot of Protocol Labs systems now as well. And basically call upon that data based on its content hash. And then in this way, you know, the idea was that data could be served much more readily to the users who were looking for it. And this would work for arbitrarily large data sets as well, including some of the scientific data sets that we originally wanted to be able to serve globally. And so that was kind of the origin for IPFS. One of the discoveries over the last few years has been that the way that IPFS works today, it's a peer-to-peer network, and a lot of the actual storage that is contributed to the network is voluntary. So if people, you know, IPFS nodes will sort of store data on their local machines, kind of in a cache in essence. And so over time, that cache will be cleared if the data isn't being pinned to the local node. And if you are just kind of a casual IPFS user, often you're not actually doing that work of like storing other people's data and pinning it to your local node. So over time, it's just so that the system can continue to efficiently serve data. So that's kind of like a pruning process that happens periodically. And we realized that there was a need for an incentive mechanism to kind of pair with this like peer-to-peer storage network. And that was where the idea for Filecoin came in. It was really intended to be this like incentive layer for the peer-to-peer storage system that already existed with IPFS. And so today, these you know, Protocol Labs projects have changed a lot. And we actually now, I think we actually, you know, call out our three main projects. There's Filecoin, IPFS, and libp2p. We realized that sort of like the networking layer that was previously inherent to the IPFS protocol was actually really valuable on its own. And so that became libp2p, and now libp2p is its own standalone project and is used by many different you know, decentralized web and Web3 projects as well, including many other blockchains. IPFS continues to you know, be that core file storage protocol that we use, and it's also what powers the Filecoin protocol as well. So, you know, some of the core features like content addressing is something that also exists in Filecoin. And then Filecoin sort of has like this whole separate weird world of like crypto economics and a cryptocurrency associated with it to provide really that incentive mechanism. So the protocols do work together. Filecoin also, you know, uses libp2p as well as its networking layer. So Filecoin kind of, you can think of it built on the stack, which is like libp2p and IPFS. In practice today, the IPFS and Filecoin networks kind of exist as separate networks, but there are ways to bridge the two networks. So if you're on the IPFS network, if data exists in the Filecoin network, you can't exactly like retrieve it from the Filecoin network super seamlessly, but we're building bridges between the two networks, and all of the functionality exists for them to eventually be merged one day. But we want to make sure that the two ecosystems and the two protocols serve the exact use cases that they have, you know, been meaning to serve and had been evolving to serve over the last few years before we like merge both of the networks. But that's, you know, planned in the roadmap for Protocol Labs.
Yeah, that's a great overview. I want to hone in on something you said there that I think is important to understand. That I think a lot of technical people at crypto projects know this because they use the Protocol Labs stack, libp2p and IPFS. But a really important thing here is that IPFS, like you said, is live, has been live. Files and data are being stored on it, have been for a long time. And that's a totally functional product out there today in the world. I don't know when it officially, I mean, a couple of years at least, that it's been actively storing data. And Filecoin is now solving for this problem within IPFS, which is, okay, we need an incentive layer to make sure that if there's more kind of rigorous applications required where certain requirements need to be met around data storage, replication, retrieval time, all these different pieces, that we can actually incentivize the actors on that network to do that. And so I do just think that's a really important piece of this, that, you know, IPFS is live, it's being used, and it's being used by other crypto projects right now that are also live.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, thank you for calling that out. That's exactly right. Yeah, IPFS is is used by many, many projects in the ecosystem. We run a public gateway, which is, you know, sometimes the applications will pin data and then kind of try to make it accessible through the IPFS gateway so that it can be accessed via an HTTP API. And the gateway gets something like, I think, 15 million requests a day or something like that. So, you know, and there's several, like hundreds of terabytes being stored within the IPFS network today. And yeah, definitely looking to see a lot of growth there as well.
That's remarkable. So we've covered kind of what IPFS and Filecoin are. I guess the next question is the why. Like, why is it that we need something like IPFS? Why is it that we need something like Filecoin? And what do you see as the rationale for creating those things beyond just, you know, this is an interesting product, beyond the initial kind of scientific data set use case? Why do these products exist?
Yeah, totally. And maybe I'll focus a little bit more on the Filecoin side, because that's kind of my area of expertise. Yeah, so specifically for Filecoin, Filecoin kind of intends to solve a lot of the problems that we've seen with some of the centralized storage infrastructures that power the internet today. They're really brittle, not incredibly robust, and are subject to all sorts of you know, government control and things that like make it so that information that ideally would be publicly accessible on the internet isn't always. And so specifically, there are kind of like 5 main problems that we think Filecoin likes to address. One is just this idea that Filecoin is sort of like it is basically a decentralized cloud. The idea is that, you know, anyone in the world who has storage capacity to contribute to this network, they may be in different geographies, they may have different cost structures, they may have other differentiating features, such as, you know, they try to make their facilities GDPR compliant or HIPAA compliant or things like this, can contribute that storage to the Filecoin network, and anyone who wants to store their data on the Filecoin network can hire that storage as well. So just, you know, serving this functionality of all of this data is sort of orchestrated by the internet. This data transfer is orchestrated by the internet, so it's kind of like a cloud in that sense. But it's like really all the supply side, the actual like service is provided by a number of different players. So it's decentralized in that sense. Another one of the core problems that we see with centralized clouds today is that users are not always do not always own their own data, right? So within the Filecoin network, you as a client of the network who's directly storing your data with a Filecoin miner, or as a developer on the network, get to make your own decisions about what happens to the data that you store on the network. So sometimes we'll see with centralized clouds today that platforms may decide they don't want to support a particular type of application anymore, and then those applications don't really have alternatives. And so we see app death from like these kind of unfortunate decisions that platforms maybe make in their best interest, but it's not maybe in the best interest of all of their users. So this is the sort of thing that with Filecoin can't really happen today. And so we wanted to solve for this too, where applications and users really do get to make their own decisions about what's going to happen with the future of their application and their data. And then the third problem is just recognizing that there is a tremendous amount of storage capacity that exists in the world. We did some analysis of this a few years ago, and it's like insane. I think it's on the order of zettabytes of just storage capacity that are idle in any given moment in the world. And Filecoin intends to create this marketplace, kind of like an Airbnb for storage, where these otherwise idle resources that are really valuable can be put to hire on a network like this. And so it's kind of bringing market dynamics and market efficiency to an otherwise like idle or underutilized asset. And this is especially given like the trend of how the world is changing and more data is being created every single second. We don't want to throw any of it away if we don't have to. So kind of like trying to pair the growing need for storage with like the huge storage capacity that exists is another problem that Filecoin tries to solve. The fourth is kind of this idea of like having verifiable storage. So Filecoin requires storage providers or storage miners on the network to repeatedly generate these cryptographic proofs over time to show that when they say that they're storing someone's data, they actually are. And these proofs are posted to the Filecoin blockchain. They're publicly verifiable. And it's something that gives clients on the network this sort of assurance that their data is being stored correctly and also can be verified by anyone else in the system. So the system is allowed to work trustlessly in that way. And Andy, you and I can maybe talk a little bit more about some applications for this later on, because I think this is like a really exciting thing. And then the last is sort of just like thinking about market pricing and efficiency in that sense. So we talked a little bit about pairing these underutilized assets with like demand, but there's also just the fact that, you know, with centralized storage solutions, you don't get to control the pricing for the service. And in this sort of market, people are allowed to enter into economic contracts that are affordable for them. Like different miners might be charging different prices for their storage, and different clients might be willing to pay different amounts for storage. And if you have a sufficient liquidity on both sides of the market, you can make for more efficient transactions and matching of service to like what people are willing to pay for. So yeah, so it's kind of a lot of information, but lots of problems it's trying to solve.
Totally. I actually think it's worth spending the time to dig into maybe each of those at least briefly, because it really feels like the core of, I mean, this is why Filecoin exists. So let's talk about that, and then maybe we can talk about use cases within, you know, each of these categories and what's particularly valuable. But I'll just kind of go through them in the order that you said, and maybe we can expand a little bit more. First, really interesting implications around this idea that anyone can be a miner and can contribute their own capabilities to this. And, you know, I would love to hear more about how you think about this. You mentioned a few examples, but it does seem really interesting to me that, you know, people can have different capabilities with storage, and those capabilities might be, like you said, something like GDPR compliance or HIPAA compliance. They might be that they're geographically situated in an area that's really advantageous to store a certain type of data, right? If users are in Africa or Europe or Asia, ideally you want the storage to be close to those people. And so there's kind of differentiation here. And today what we have to do as a result of the centralized cloud is defer to whatever kind of consolidated product offerings these centralized cloud giants want to offer us. You know, I go onto AWS and I can select, they have a lot of regions, but I still am selecting, you know, Virginia or Northern California, or, you know, one of a few places, as opposed to maybe I want data storage in Oklahoma, or I want data storage in Michigan. And so I'd love to hear about kind of what applications you think that will enable, or what you think that will make more efficient when we see a real marketplace where anyone with any capability can be, you know, a storage miner.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and maybe one thing to touch on first as well is a planned future upgrade to Filecoin, which includes this concept of a retrieval market as well. So, you know, Filecoin today, the core functionality of Filecoin is enabling data storage in the decentralized storage network. And so when we launch the Filecoin mainnet, it will be launching with the decentralized storage network. And we have a number of solutions that are kind of in the works as well for retrieval markets that would allow, so because you could imagine there being some economies of scale to having, you know, data centers that are really large, and like if you want to have a really large data center, you might want to have it in a place where it's really cheap to run a data center like that, or like it's really easy to get hardware that's really affordable or something. And so we might see some more, you know, and all this is TBD because the network hasn't launched yet, but we might start to see like pockets of storage mining in certain geographies in the world, and it's not maybe as like completely distributed. Longer term, I think that will definitely be the case, but at least in the early days of the network. But the idea behind the retrieval market is that you may have your data kind of like stored at rest in these like storage mining centers of the Filecoin network, but you may have retrieval miners who are really like that could be anyone, just individuals like yourself or myself. And we live in cities where maybe it doesn't necessarily make sense to run these huge storage mining rigs, but we can like, you know, look at the data that's most popular on the network and store that data. And then when retrieval requests come in from that data, we can serve it from our like local storage of retrieval copies that we have made or something like that. And so the intent behind that is to really just allow some more differentiation in the market, and really to allow more specialization for storage miners that really maybe want to focus on having really efficient storage operations. But this retrieval market, you can kind of think of it like an edge network or some sort of like a decentralized CDN that allows us to eventually reach the sort of retrieval performance and speeds that we want to see out of a network like this, so that it can really start to be a foundation for all sorts of use cases and applications. So that's maybe like one thing. I mean, I think longer term, what we will definitely see on the Filecoin network is this sort of, I think we're going to see this specialization in terms of what roles miners are playing in the network, and once we get there, we'll also start seeing just greater performance. So I think that's like one of the things that this enables is Filecoin really can operate as like a decentralized CDN, and potentially much more powerful than any sort of centralized solution that exists. Because if you imagine, you know, retrieval miners are being paid as well to serve this data back. So there's an incentive for people to maybe use their spare bandwidth. Like if they're not using their like full bandwidth capacity in any given day, maybe they can use it for like serving files to the people who are requesting it on the Filecoin network. And so if you have a lot of people like this, and there may be strong economic incentives for people to participate in this portion of the Filecoin economy, retrieval speeds could be really, really fast. And so it's kind of interesting just thinking about like Filecoin as a decentralized CDN. And then once we start getting into that territory, it just really opens up like the sorts of use cases that can be supported on the peer-to-peer network. I don't know if there's any one particular use case that I think it would serve, but I think it just like starts to look like anything can really be possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that it feels like kind of a step change where the visibility to know what's on the other side of that, when we have this totally distributed CDN with speeds that could be massively faster than we see today for centralized CDNs, it's almost impossible to imagine what those use cases are going to be, in the same way that, you know, I think it would have been very hard to imagine 30, 40 years ago that, you know, videos, and we'd be doing this video chat right now over the internet, and that didn't seem possible at the time. So yeah, lots of ground to cover there. The second point you noted, and problem that Filecoin solves, is around this data ownership, and users owning their own data. I think you put it really interestingly, which is, you know, platforms and centralized providers sometimes do things that are in their best interest, but not in the best interest of the user. And what I think is interesting about that framing and the way you're describing it is that there's no implication of kind of right or wrong here. In fact, everyone can be right. And it just may be that what a user wants to do with their own data is different than what a platform wants to do with that data. And, you know, you can have your opinions about which side is right in any given case, but I don't think there's an objective measure there. But what Filecoin's enabling here is, you know, the putting control back in the hands of the users and letting them make their own decisions. So, you know, are there any cases you think about there, either kind of positive use cases that you think would really benefit from that kind of perspective shift, or cases that you've seen in the past that you think are examples where Filecoin, you know, if it had existed and stepped in, would have solved the problem?
Yeah. I also, yeah, definitely think that's a really interesting perspective too. And I mean, I think that that's very much aligned with how like in terms of where Filecoin wants to be. Filecoin does not want to be the layer that's deciding what is right or wrong, or what people can or cannot see on the internet, or what's accessible or inaccessible, and really just wants to be the core protocol, which is intended to be like as invisible as possible, that powers all of these sorts of experiences. And so I think that we've seen a lot of just more recently, just these conversations around user privacy and like data privacy on the internet, especially in like some of the really popular platforms that people use a lot today. And we've seen a lot of conversation as well about just, you know, like having some sort of the trust and safety teams, right, of various different platforms as well, making decisions about the sort of content that is or isn't okay on their platforms, and so on. And I think there's a conversation there that I don't really have super strong opinions on, but like, you know, the idea that with something like Filecoin, you really could enable any sort of user or any sort of application that wants to that wants to make these own calls for itself, that wants to subscribe to different sorts of allow lists or deny lists that kind of enable it to, you know, if it wants to follow certain sorts of government regulations, or you know, just like there are all these lists that come, for example, from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, like deny lists for sort of the sort of content that they don't want to be accessible on the internet. Like individual applications and users on the network can make the decision for the sort of content that they do want their users to be able to post and see. And Filecoin aims to be like a very not unopinionated layer beneath all of that, and really leave all of those decisions up to the user. I think one application that we talk about a bit internally is just this idea of data marketplaces. This is something that's like come up a bit within the Web3 space. There are a number of projects that are kind of working on building these marketplaces, where the idea is that as a user, I myself, like, I have a Facebook account, maybe I have a Twitter account, and there's a bunch of data that's associated with my profile on those accounts. But today, Twitter and Facebook are the companies that like will generate a lot of profit off of just selling my data for advertisement purposes. And I don't really get anything as the person who's like providing this value to the service. So I think the companies that are intending to build these data marketplaces want users to be able to capture some of that value, where, you can rent access to your data or something like that for advertising purposes, but you don't have to if you don't want to. And so they so having this like concept of users owning their data, being able to like provide access to it as desired to various different services, and so on, like Filecoin is kind of the perfect storage backbone for a system like that. And so I think that we might start to see more applications like that over the next few months, especially as like Filecoin becomes a real thing and people can actually build those applications on top of the protocol.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the perspective makes a ton of sense. Neutral platform, just trying to provide infrastructure to support whatever applications and use cases that the world pulls out of it. Yeah, the third thing you mentioned is around this idle storage point, and the fact that there is just idle storage sitting around the world, and lots of it, that is underutilized. And I think, again, you mentioned something that goes underappreciated here, that the demand for storage in the world is not constant. And in fact, it's not even that it's increasing linearly, that the demand for storage is increasing at some number of bytes per year. It is a crazy, it continues to go up in this crazy parabolic motion. The demand for storage is totally outpacing the supply, and data's lost. And what's crazy about that is that, to your point, there are idle storage resources, and a lot of them that could be used to help soak up that demand. And it's just going unused. So when you think about that, again, are there use cases, are there things that you think about where like this idle storage would solve a problem that we see in the world today around some sort of data loss or something that just isn't getting captured because the demand for storage is so far outpacing the supply?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that so we have like some of the numbers that we like to keep in mind to motivate ourselves, or I think it's something like we generate, I think 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. And that includes like, several hundred billion emails and like several hundred million tweets and just like several billion WhatsApp messages and stuff. So it's a huge volume of data. And specifically, like when it comes to scientific data, this is actually a use case that we have spent a lot of time thinking about, because when talking to some of our collaborators who are scientific institutions, they generate data from various sensors and just like telemetry information that is so massive that they can't possibly store all of it. A lot of the information is actually even currently being stored on tape just because they want to keep it around, but it's like then not very accessible for scientific analysis. But a lot of it they just discard because like the volume is too huge, and they've come up with heuristics for like knowing which sorts of data they want to keep, but it's just too expensive to kind of store all of it. And while obviously the process of scientific analysis and discovery and inquiry is like pretty sophisticated, so they're probably doing a reasonably good job about these heuristics that they're using to determine what data to store and what to discard. who knows, right? Like, I mean, there could be all sorts of information that's within the discarded data that could yield many new insights, maybe even insights that we're not initially looking for the purpose for which we captured the data. Maybe it doesn't directly lend itself to answering that question, but could be used down the road for all sorts of other data analysis. And so we started this project called Filecoin Discover a few months ago that was intending to prove the concept that you could actually store insanely large volumes of data on the Filecoin network. And that was, working with a bunch of groups that have large volumes of data and building a pipeline for those institutions to store their data on the Filecoin network. And we've already begun onboarding some of this data onto the network. It's like several, I think the aim is for us to like reach 100 petabytes of the sort of like scientific data and cultural data that's stored in the network. And already there are like several petabytes that are being stored on the Filecoin testnet. But yeah, I mean, that's the hope, is like, we maybe live in a world one day where we don't have to throw away as much, especially like socially or culturally relevant information or scientific data that could yield some really valuable insights down the road. Who knows if like the Filecoin network will be able to keep up, maybe storage on the Filecoin network is also never going to be able to keep up with the growth of just data in the world, because that is just ever increasing. But maybe it can help to start with. And yeah, I think there are a lot of open questions there, but we're really optimistic about like Filecoin's role in that whole equation.
Yeah. I don't want to speak for the whole world, but certainly for myself, until I had started to dig into Filecoin, I did not fully appreciate how much data is just lost to the sands of time irrevocably. I think I had in my head at some point that, everything's captured these days. There's data everywhere. Everything's stored somewhere. Once something's on the internet, it never goes away. That's the kind of mantra that everyone says. It's just not true. Things disappear all the time. Mm-hmm. And it feels like, something Filecoin's leveraging here is there's so much excess capacity in the world that's just not being used because it's not set up in a big centralized data warehouse. And Filecoin can open that up and hopefully save some of these relics that we were missing. And it does feel like, we're now a couple of decades into kind of the consumer internet existing, and people are just now realizing that there are really important and really cool things from early days of the internet that are gone.
Yeah.
That may never come back. And I think there's a real desire to make that not happen again in the future, which is very cool. Okay, I'm going to come back to verifiable storage, because the last point you mentioned is kind of related to this idle storage, which is market pricing. Mm-hmm. And this feels like kind of for everyone watching, listening, and certainly for us, if you pay attention to crypto, the idea of market pricing resonates with you, because that's so much of what this entire space is doing. Can you talk just for a minute about, again, kind of what you think a market priced kind of data storage capability will enable for the world, and what is not being served right now that you think would be served if we had true market pricing for data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this is one of those things that's also just like a core economic concept, which probably the world should be leveraging more. Like, maybe this is why we've seen so many marketplaces like come up over the last decade or so. But yeah, I mean, I think that the main idea is just that enabling a marketplace for valuable resources, or maybe like previously not considered to be super valuable, or thought of that there would be like a market for like various storage that's like differentiated in minor ways, but creating a market for that can enable all sorts of matchmaking between like demand and supply that doesn't really exist if you kind of have a one size fits all pricing solution. So there's some like in normal pricing strategy, like as many folks may know, you see a lot of companies that will, if they're like providing a centralized service, they'll have like these tiered solutions for their users, because that allows users to kind of self-select into like the package that makes the most sense for them. And a marketplace just allows that at like infinite granularity almost, and so I think that we'll see a lot of, especially as we were just sort of talking about, just creating, data that maybe otherwise wouldn't be stored. maybe it can be stored now because there might be, miners in the marketplace who are willing to take petabytes of data at a really low per gigabyte rate or something like that. But because it's over huge storage volumes, it ends up being worth it for the miner and kind of like justifying their cost structure. And on maybe the higher end of the spectrum, you might see users that have really, really sensitive. So we talked a little bit before about like HIPAA compliance, so really sensitive medical data or like really, really important like private information that we need to preserve for whatever reason. It's like really important for analysis that we want to do as part of this this like company service maybe, and that is maybe storage for which, and maybe there's also like in your country data localization laws that require you to store that sort of data within a particular geographic region, and so maybe those types of users might be willing to pay a lot more for storage that meets these like various requirements that they have. And so I think it's going to be really interesting. I don't think, because we don't really have a model in the world for a storage marketplace today, it's hard to see like exactly what this will enable. But I do think having this like differentiation within the storage market is going to allow a lot better matchmaking between user needs for storage and the supply that exists out there than could be served with the systems that exist today. And I think it just creates a lot more efficiency. You don't have to pay for things that you don't need. And there almost certainly will be someone in the network that has like a solution that meets what you're looking for at a price that you're looking for. So, yeah.
Yeah. Just one thing I would just hit on there to make sure this is super clear, because I think this is one of the most interesting pieces of Filecoin. I think when a lot of people think about the idea of a data storage marketplace, they just think undifferentiated storage, right? Oh, what's the cost per gigabyte to store this file? And what Filecoin's enabling is a way more nuanced marketplace. Like you were saying, I get to think about my use case. Oh, I need my data to be stored in the United States. I have X amount of it, or it's huge, or it's really tiny, or, there's all sorts of variables around my use case, whatever my use case happens to be. And what a true data storage marketplace enables is market pricing for each possible combination of criteria. And so it's not that, on the Filecoin network, a gigabyte of storage for a year costs, X Filecoin no matter what. It's that, a gigabyte of storage with this availability, this replication, stored in this geography, that costs this. And I think that's just a really powerful concept that, again, only exists in the most limited form today. Like these centralized, data storage providers, you can say, I want HIPAA compliance, and they'll tell you how much it costs to add that on, but they do not allow this sort of configurability and marketplace and market pricing for, every use case that users might want. I think it's really powerful. The last piece that you talked about, I just want to dig in on a little bit more, and then we're getting close to wrapping up here, but is verifiable storage. Can you just talk a little bit more about what verifiable storage means? It's kind of a new concept, and why it's valuable for the world.
Yeah, definitely. So verifiable storage basically means this idea that, so when you first decide to store your data on the Filecoin network with a storage miner, the miner is required to produce what we call a proof of replication. So it's one of like the custom proofs that the Filecoin research team has sort of invented. And the idea is that like the proof of replication, the miner needs to compute this proof on your data and then submit the receipt or sort of the commitment to the Filecoin blockchain. And the proof is sort of constructed in a way that like any node in the Filecoin network can verify that proof is actually correct. And so sort of by the benefits of, by the guarantees of cryptography, that if you can validate the proof, that it is actually like a verification that the data was kind of stored correctly. And then there's another type of proof in the Filecoin system as well called a proof of spacetime, which is it's a repeated, like periodically miners are asked to generate proofs of spacetime to show that they have been continuing to store that data correctly over time. And so so the combination of like these different cryptographic mechanisms makes it so that when when a miner says that they're storing your data, there are publicly verifiable ways for you as anyone on the network to make sure and actually validate that that is in fact correct. And what's really cool about it too is that when the data is first stored on the blockchain in the network, the actual like content hash of the data that was stored is also kind of stamped into the particular block at which this whole process began. And I think that there are like really interesting applications for this. So one of them is being able to like fight some forms of misinformation. You can imagine use cases in which, maybe like some data was stored on the Filecoin network, the content hash is stamped into the Filecoin blockchain. There are these repeated proofs that show that that data was continued to be stored over time. And then in the normal world, like someone has an altered or a tampered version of that same data. And they sort of say that like the original copy is actually fake or has some like false information. But the cool thing about content hashing is that you could sort of generate a content hash of both of these like versions of the same information. And you could see that the tampered with version of the data has a different content hash than than what was stamped into the blockchain, and make some sort of like reasonable argument that this is actually like the new thing is sort of like the false information. And we've seen this actually with a couple of the partners that we've been working with. This has been kind of like an interesting feature, especially for certain types of like cultural records, like, testimony of certain sorts of historical events or original artworks or things like this, where, there's like a pretty, it's important to have like, the trail of like provenance of, where this data came from and so on. And that's like, those are like some really interesting use cases that we've seen people coming to Filecoin for because of this combination of the unique proofs that we're using in the system and also the content hashing, which is also kind of unique to Filecoin.
Really interesting. We're going to wrap up with a couple last things here. One, just quick question I have for you. You've thrown around a lot of big numbers on this call, quadrillions of bytes and petabytes and zettabytes and all these things. How does the Protocol Labs team get a handle on how big these, like, how do you even, I hear these numbers and it just is hard to think about what that means. Do you have heuristics or ways you think about kind of what these, how to, estimate or kind of understand at a high level what those sizes are?
That's a super interesting question. I think we do internally talk a lot about the order of petabytes and exabytes. So I think that is, that's something that we definitely, I think now it's almost sort of like we measure those, our way of understanding those numbers is in like what it means for the Filecoin project. So in terms of exabytes, that's kind of the storage capacity that we expect to exist to ramp onto the network in the first year. Petabytes are kind of like the scale of some of the larger data sets that we're trying to onboard onto the network. I think we've tried, I've tried this before where it's kind of like, okay, take an 8 terabyte hard drive today. What's like the dimensions of the hard drive and sort of like how many shipping containers full of hard drives does this actually represent?
Oh, yeah.
But but we don't use that as much internally, but we do definitely have some like targets for ourselves in terms of like scale of storage in these various areas. So spent a lot of time thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's crazy to try and think about these numbers and understand at any level how big they are. All right, so a couple last things I wanted to close out with how folks in this call can participate, get involved in the Filecoin ecosystem. There's two things I would love to hear about from you, and we got a question from the audience on one of these. The first is the space race, which, as with all things Protocol Labs, has a very cool name, and just getting a little bit of understanding on what's the space race and what's happening there. And then you've also had some announcements recently for kind of builders and developers, and it would be great to get a little more color on those.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that right now is actually a really perfect time to get involved as a miner and also as a developer in the Filecoin ecosystem. So Space Race, for those of you who don't know, is it's our testnet incentives competition. And so this will be launching actually within the next week or two. So if you're interested in being a miner on the network, now is honestly like the perfect time to kind of start getting your hardware set up and learning how the mining node works and how the protocol works so that you can participate in this competition. But yeah, but the intent is for that basically to be a very close simulation of what the actual Filecoin mainnet will be, especially on the mining side. It includes like kind of the final mainnet proofs that we're going to be launching the main network with as well. So that that competition to follow up on, to keep up to date with kind of like the latest one that will be launched and so on. All that information is going to be on the Filecoin blog, but that's really like the best way for miners to get involved today. And then in terms of for developers and builders, now is also a really great time for developers to start building things. We just had the HackFS hackathon, which was a month-long hackathon that recently completed. We're kind of in the judging phase for that now, but we've seen like hundreds of really exciting applications being built on IPFS and Filecoin. And so we're starting to see just like more activity within the developer ecosystem, and a lot of people coming to us looking for certain types of applications and dev tools and things like that, that they want so that they can build their own applications on Filecoin or use Filecoin. So there's starting to be a lot more activity there, and people are really hungry for Filecoin applications right now. A couple of the programs that are coming up are, one is it's called Filecoin Launchpad. It's an accelerator program that we're running in conjunction with Tachyon. It's a team out of Consensus, and this will be it'll be a program that runs for a number of weeks. I think every team, there will be 15 to 20 teams that are selected, and every team I think gets something like $80,000 in funding. Applications for that program close on August 21st, and you can also see information about this on the Filecoin blog. And then the second program is called Apollo, which we're running in partnership with Gitcoin. And this is an incubator program where it's really intended to help you know, teams that are already exist and beginning to sort of like want more like go-to-market help or things like this, get connected to people who are really prominent within the ecosystem, and like, you know, hearing their stories and connecting with mentors. And just like getting really prepared for their launches into the world. So both Filecoin Launchpad and Apollo are programs that I could recommend for people who are interested in developing on the network. And then maybe a third is the Filecoin Dev Grants program. So we've been running this program for a little bit more than a year now. And that's also just a really great way. If you have an idea for something that you want to build, you can get feedback. You can, you know, submit a PR to the Dev Grants repo and get feedback from our team on what we're seeing as like really valuable within the ecosystem. And so helping to kind of like find a good fit for the project that you might be interested in building, and providing some guidance there from the team. And we've funded like hundreds of projects through the Dev Grants program as well. So yeah, now's a great time because we're planning on launching mainnet sometime within like, you know, the next late Q3 or Q4 of this year. And being an early participant in the ecosystem, we think is going to be really, really awesome for everyone who happens to take the leap. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. There is a lot going on in the Filecoin ecosystem, especially on the dev side right now and the miner side. So yeah, recommend checking out those programs. Last thing I'll mention here is if you're not a dev or a miner, or even if you are, check out CoinList. When Filecoin launches, we'll be supporting trading for it. And so if you didn't participate earlier on in Filecoin sales, that'll be your chance to go and become part of the ecosystem more formally. And get involved. And even if you did, obviously you will get your tokens through CoinList as well. But that seems like a great place to wrap up. Pooja, thank you for coming on and doing this. If anyone wants to reach out to either of us, I think both the Twitter and the Filecoin Twitter accounts tweeted out our personal handles. So feel free to reply or DM us and talk more. And if you have any questions, as always, please reach out to the Filecoin or CoinList teams, and we'll get right back to you. But Pooja, thank you again. And thank you everyone for listening in.
Thanks so much, Andy.